in the United States. That's a fact. A company or school cannot run down to the discount store to outfit their staff because the store's inventory is planned several months before a season begins. These stores cannot reorder or custom order big buyers, and there is no certainty stock will be available the following year on the item purchased this year. Port Authority Clothes is available in quantity. You can buy 1 or 1,000 of a style of shirt in sizes ranging from small to plus sizes of 4XL, and in some brands up to 10XL. Pretty good, huh? The Port Authority Clothes PC61 t-shirt, for example, is available in more than 40 colors and goes up to a plus size 10XL. The Port Authority Clothing website, this is it. True to Size Apparel has become the biggest distributor of Port Authority clothing via our website, catering to buyers worldwide. Our Port Authority Clothing website is second to none, as True to Size Apparel features video showing potential buyers all that they need to know when trying to make a purchase online versus the scarce choices at a brick and mortar store. True to Size Apparel carries every style offered by Port Authority Clothing and can ship direct from 6 warehouses in the United States so as to provide speedy delivery. Then there's Port Authority Clothing Wholesale. That's right, wholesale. Who wants to pay retail? When it comes to getting the right price for your school or company's uniforms, everyone can buy Port Authority Clothing at wholesale prices. No minimum order requirement at True to Size Apparel here. Save big bucks on your original large order and for that new employee fill-in order, buying Port Authority Clothing wholesale every day of the year. Every day is an on-sale day here. The prices at True to Size Apparel are so low that we call them cutthroat prices. It's a lot more aggressive than wholesale, huh? Then on Port Authority Apparel, many individuals and families have learned about Port Authority Apparel at work and at school, being introduced to the brand and learning to like what they had on. True to Size Apparel does sell Port Authority Apparel to individuals for the same low price as to businesses. We do not discriminate on the basis of volume or your title. You can be mom or vice president and get the same deal 24/7, 365. If you're looking for a customized logo to be embroidered on your order, check out the embroidery
industry, since I know we're doing this program today with AFA. There's a lot of people from those industries that are on the phone today. So we'll also build in some things that are relevant for that industry as well. So let me just first start just by talking a little bit about the recent court decision. And since this just came out day before yesterday, unfortunately, I don't have a slide on it, but I think it's pretty easy to digest without a slide. The challenge to the conflict minerals rule has been kicking around since late October, so since October 22nd of last year, and I'll kind of spare you all the kind of procedural twists and turns in that. But 2 days ago, so on July 23rd, at about 4:30 in the afternoon, the district court in the case released its decision, and the district court denied the plaintiff's motion for summary judgment, and they granted the SEC's summary judgment motion. So what that means, practically speaking, is that the rule, as drafted and as adopted by the SEC last August, continues in full force and effect. So two things that are important takeaways from that. One of the things that the plaintiffs were arguing for, which was a de minimis exception, there continues not to be a de minimis exception under the rule. And then also as it relates to everybody on the phone today, one of the things that had been in contention also was whether companies that only contract to manufacture products, for example, such as retailers, should be subject to the rule, and because the district court wound up finding for the SEC on all of the arguments, companies that only contract to manufacture products also continue to be subject to the rule. So a question we get from a lot of people is, so does this mean it's over? Well, not necessarily. The plaintiffs do have the ability to appeal the decision. They have 30 days to decide to do that, so that would take them out to August 22nd, which coincidentally is also the one-year anniversary of the adoption of the rule by the SEC. And it is possible that certainly on appeal, the appellate court could disagree with the district court and vacate the rule. However, as a practical matter, what we're advising companies is you really do, if you've been sitting on the sidelines, need to now start your compliance. It could take a number of months, assuming the rule is even appealed, to get a decision out of the appellate court, and the decision could be to uphold the rule. So given the amount of time, it is going to take a lot of companies to implement their compliance programs, and we'll talk about some of the details of that during the course of our presentation today, and a lot of the work that goes along with that. Now is really the time to be starting your compliance efforts in earnest, to the extent that you've been sitting on the sidelines. So that's a little bit of an overview of the case. So what I want to do now is just go through and give you a little bit of an overview of the rule itself. And we're just going to do this at a very high level. And the reason that I want to do this today, since we do have a really big audience on the phone, I find when we do these bigger programs that there's always a fair amount of people that are somewhat new to the topic. Maybe you've just been added to the conflict minerals team very recently within your organization. So we're just going to do this at a high level and just spend a few minutes on it. So what does the rule provide? Well, generally what the rule provides is that if you are a public company and conflict minerals are necessary to the functionality or production of products that you manufacture or that you contract to manufacture, then every year you have to file a form with the SEC, what's known as a new Form SD, indicating whether the conflict minerals that are contained in those in-scope products originated in the Democratic Republic of the Congo or one of the 9 adjoining countries. Now, to the extent that the conflict minerals that are contained in your in-scope products originated in the DRC or one of those other adjoining countries, then you also have to file under cover of your Form SD a separate report with the SEC, what's known as a conflict minerals report. And there's 3 principal things that the conflict minerals report has to do. So one, it has to detail the measures that you took to exercise due diligence on the source and chain of custody of the conflict minerals that are contained in your applicable products. You have to indicate the products that have not been found to be what's known as DRC conflict-free, and then you also have to include information concerning the origin of the conflict minerals in those products, trying to trace them as far back as possible to the mine or location of origin. Now, generally speaking, the conflict minerals report has to be audited, and there's different options for audits in terms of performance audits and attestation audits, but as many of you know, there is a pass on the audit requirement for anywhere from 2 to 4 years to the extent you're able to avail yourself of what's known as the conflict undeterminable exemption, so to the extent that you're not able to trace the origin of the conflict minerals that are in your products. Now, the purpose of this rule is to reduce a significant source of funding for armed groups that are committing human rights abuses in the Eastern DRC. So it's what a lot of people refer to as a name and shame rule, so meaning that by shining a light on corporate procurement practices, the rule is intended to encourage companies to move toward sourcing from conflict-free sources. Now, as many of you are aware, the rule requires up to a three-step inquiry, and whether you get to steps 2 and 3 of the inquiry is going to be a function of how you answer the questions under each of the preceding steps of the inquiry. And we won't go through this in detail, but essentially the 3 steps of the inquiry are: 1 is figuring out what your in-scope products are for purposes of the rule. 2nd, doing something called a reasonable country of origin inquiry to determine where the conflict minerals that are in your in-scope products came from, or whether they're from recycled or scrap sources. And then 3, to the extent that you do have conflict minerals in those products that come from the DRC countries, you then have to do enhanced due diligence. Now, the important thing to remember is that to get a lot of this information that you're going to need as part of your 3-step inquiry, you're going to have to wind up working with your suppliers. So a lot of this is going to be information that you're not going to have in-house within your companies. And now here on this slide, this is where I want to get into a little bit of some things that are specific to apparel and footwear. In terms of kind of what are conflict minerals, so people typically refer to the derivative metals when they're talking about conflict minerals. So tin, tantalum, tungsten, and gold, which people frequently refer to as the 3 T's in gold, or 3TG. And in terms of some of the applications of conflict minerals, so I've tailored this slide over here more specifically to apparel and footwear, and I want to give a nod to AFA on this because this is based on materials that they've put out. And you can see that in apparel and footwear, conflict minerals are used in a lot of different products and have a lot of different applications. And the takeaway from this is that it's not always obvious whether a particular product has conflict minerals. So, for example, you see leather here, and leather can include tin as a result of the tanning process, or metallicized yarns, which can have tin or gold in them. So, in many cases, you can kind of look at a product and determine whether a conflict mineral is in it, but it's not always obvious. And that's not just particular to apparel and footwear, but also to many other product categories as well. And one of the things that we've found in practice is that, when a lot of companies do their initial product determinations to try and figure out which products might be in scope and contain conflict minerals, when people do that at a high level, a lot of times when they go back and do a deeper dive, we find that they reverse some of their earlier determinations, and they sometimes have many more products that are potentially in scope than they originally thought. Now, we've talked about a lot of what's on this slide already. So the covered countries, as I mentioned before, so it's the DRC, which is that big red country in the middle, and then the 9 adjoining countries that are around the DRC. And then also just on the right side of this slide, I have a little bit of information that comes from the Enough Project as to the approximate percentage of conflict minerals production that comes from the Eastern DRC, which is, of course, the portion of the DRC that the statute is primarily concerned with. Now, the way that this rule is set up, so the rule only applies to public companies directly as it's set up. So what that means is that the only people who have any filing and disclosure requirements under the rule are public companies. And it affects a pretty broad swath of the public company universe. The SEC estimates that about 6,000 public companies will have to do some level of inquiry under the rule and at least file a Form SD. They estimate that about 3/4 of those companies will have to go on to Step 3, as we saw on the earlier slide, and prepare also a conflict minerals report, although I think that probably that 4,500 number is a little low, and it's probably going to be, at least in year 1, a more substantial percentage of the 6,000. Now, the rule applies to pretty much all public companies equally, so it applies to domestic public companies, foreign companies that are public in the United States, large public companies, small public companies, and the only difference in how public companies are treated under the rule is that smaller companies can avail themselves of the conflict undeterminable designation for up to 4 years, where most companies can only use it for 2 years. Even though the rule only applies directly to public companies, it also affects private company suppliers. And private company suppliers don't have any direct obligations under the rule, but as a practical matter, many private companies, including I'm sure everybody on this phone that's private, you have public companies that are somewhere downstream in your supply chain. So they're either your direct or indirect customers, and because public companies will need to get information from their direct and indirect suppliers to comply with the rule, you're going to indirectly be picked up by the rule. So you're not going to have any formal reporting requirements under the rule, but as a practical matter, you're going to have to put in place compliance procedures for gathering information and providing information that are similar to what a lot of your public company direct and indirect customers are going to have to do as well. So in terms of when disclosure begins under the rule, so we're already a little more than halfway through the first disclosure period under the rule. The rule took effect on January 1st, 2013. It provides for calendar year compliance. So the first report is going to be due on May 31st, 2014, so that first Form SD, and if a CMR is required, the CMR as well that goes with that, and that report is going to cover calendar year 2013. And the important thing to remember as you go through your compliance efforts and you're building out your program is this is not a one-shot disclosure obligation. So this is something that you're going to have to do every year, so you're going to have to build out a program that's robust and also can be adapted going forward. Okay, so that's everything I want to talk about on the rule itself. Now, as I mentioned, we went through the rule at a very high level. It's important to note that there is an SEC adopting release out there that's about 356 pages. The adopting release does go into more detail on some of the things that I briefly hit on. So, for example, although there's not bright line definitions, there is guidance in the adopting release as to what it means to contract to manufacture, what does it mean for conflict minerals to be necessary to the functionality or production of a product, how do you do your RCOI. So there is a lot more guidance that's in the adopting release as well as in the rule itself, so you just need to be mindful of that. So the next thing that I just want to talk a little bit about, and this gets into some additional guidance that the SEC has put out, is the SEC came out with 12 FAQs on the rule, and these came out at the end of May. Now, the FAQs only offer limited guidance. They go through a very kind of small percentage of the questions that issuers have and that they're trying to deal with on a day-to-day basis in applying the rule. But generally speaking, I think the FAQs are helpful. A lot of them are consistent with the adopting release and market interpretation, so they didn't really tell people a lot that's new. But the ones that did give a little bit of new information, those were favorable to issuers. Now, the FAQs, you can loosely break them down into two categories. First, what I'll refer to as Step 1 FAQs. So FAQs that relate to determining what's in scope for purposes of the conflict minerals rule, and then FAQs that deal more with reporting. Now, we're not going to go through all of the FAQs today, but I want to just talk about a few that are of a little more general applicability and that I think will be relevant and of interest to the audience that we have on the phone today. And I want to talk about 3 FAQs in particular, and I'm going to talk about the first 3 FAQs that are on this slide, so these first 3 bullet points. Now, as I mentioned before, most of the FAQs are pretty similar to what's already in the adopting release or follow widely held market interpretations. And one of the big kind of gray areas and question marks that a lot of people had under the rule before the FAQs came out was, how should you treat packaging for purposes of the rule? Now, this isn't as big of an issue for people in the apparel and footwear industry just based on the nature of packaging that you have. Most of it doesn't have metallic content, and even if it did, arguably it wasn't necessary to the functionality or production of the product anyway, and would have been out of scope, but we did see some situations where potentially retailers did have to worry, or other people in the apparel and footwear industry had to worry a little bit about packaging. So in one of the FAQs, what the SEC indicated is that packaging is out of scope, so packaging is not considered to be part of the product for purposes of how you define your product within the meaning of the rule. And one of the things that the SEC noted in reaching that conclusion is that packaging is generally disposed of and not kept by the consumer of the product. Now, the second FAQ that I want to talk about here, so there was some language on this in the adopting release. So one of the things that the SEC indicated in the adopting release is that you are not deemed to contract to manufacture a product if all you did was had somebody put your name, logo, or brand on the product, so if it was affixed to it. So this particular FAQ just provides a little more granularity on that general principle that was in the adopting release. What the SEC indicated in the FAQs is that if you have a logo that's etched on a product, as opposed to some other means of affixing it on there, that does not render the product in scope for purposes of the rule. And then the third FAQ that I want to talk about, now this is one of these that the SEC didn't break any new ground on. This was something they dealt with in the adopting release, but I think they put out an FAQ because they felt that this one was a continuing source of confusion for a lot of companies, and certainly we have found that the case with a lot of companies that we've spoken with, is that you have to remember that to the extent you have generic components that are in a higher level product, those generic components are not excluded from compliance for purposes of the conflict minerals rule. So what that means is that as you're kind of thinking about what's in scope for purposes of the rule, if you have generic components that you're buying from a third party and you're incorporating those components into your particular product, the fact that you did not have any influence over that particular component, that doesn't knock the component out. And this does come up a lot especially in the apparel industry, because there's a lot of components that go into garments, for example, that you're purchasing from third parties that you otherwise don't have any influence over. But it's important to remember that those components are going to be in scope for purposes of the products that you manufacture or otherwise contract to manufacture. So the next set of FAQs here, which again I'm not going to go through these, but these are the FAQs that deal with reporting, but I wanted to just put all of the FAQs on these two slides so you just had a high-level summary of them kind of in one place for convenience. But if you want more detail on the FAQs themselves, there's a link here to an article that we put out on the FAQs when it came out. I'm also happy to send that article to anybody. If you send me an email at michael.littenberg@srz.com, I can send you that after the program as well. Okay, so that takes us to the next piece of my remarks that I want to go to, and I want to talk a little bit about some tips related to building out your company's compliance roadmap. And I'm not going to talk about everything that's on these next several slides. We could easily build out an all-day program just what's on these next few slides. And even then, this would just be a portion of the things that you would have to be mindful of when you build out your compliance program. But instead, what I want to do is just provide you with some practical tips from our experience working with a lot of companies, including a lot of people that are in the apparel and footwear industry, as well as a lot of retailers. So some tips to help you kind of get from now to May 31st of next year, which is the date that you have to do your first filing. One of the things that's important to keep in mind is that, even though we're not going to go through all of the items on all of these slides, as you think through your compliance efforts and your compliance program, it's going to be important, I think, to give thought to all of the items that are going to be highlighted on these slides. So this is just a summary slide, and there's lots of steps that are going to be part of your compliance program and that are going to be critical for successfully and efficiently getting to May 31st of next year, and some of the more important steps are summarized on this page, and then on subsequent pages we're going to be talking about selected elements of each of these items. So I'm not going to go through everything you need to know about assembling your team, but I just want to deal with one common question and one problem that we're seeing in a fair amount of companies. So a lot of people ask me, well, kind of who should run this process? And if you've seen a lot of the stats out there, I think at companies it's pretty evenly split between legal and procurement, in terms of how companies organize it. And what I tell people is I don't think it matters so much how you run who runs the process, but kind of how you balance the process. And it's important to, I think, strike that right balance between legal and procurement, because legal and procurement tend to come at these sorts of projects in very different ways. People in legal tend to be very focused on the reporting and the disclosure and, the risk management aspects of this. And, people in procurement, who aren't historically as involved with SEC reporting and usually aren't at all involved with it, they're more focused on the data gathering and the vendor outreach and, synthesizing all of that data. And, what we've seen with a lot of the programs people have put together, at least at the early stages of those programs, is that their programs are out of balance. So they're either too focused on the legal end or they're too focused on the procurement end. And, so it's important to make sure, that your program has the right focus and the right balance and the right involvement of both of those groups, so that you can get where you need to get. Because what we have found is that a lot of people, if they go too far, on the legal side and not far enough on the procurement side or vice versa, there tends to be a pretty high degree of inefficiency, and, companies have to then go back and, kind of rethink their approaches on some of the elements of their program. Let's talk a little bit about, one of the places where, we're seeing companies falling short is they're starting to get up to speed on conflict minerals rule compliance. And I think, most people at this point, they have a pretty good understanding of the rule. They've read the adopting release, or they've read any of the hundreds of memos out there on it, including the ones that we've put out. But, where we see a lot of companies falling short on this is in their understanding of the OECD guidance. And it's going to be very important to have a good handle on the OECD framework and the OECD guidance, because it's going to be relevant to step 3 of the due diligence process. For purposes of step 3 of your due diligence, you have to do that in accordance with the nationally or internationally recognized framework under the rule, and the only framework in town for that is the OECD framework, at least at the present time. And the OECD framework, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it consists of base guidance. Then there's also 2 supplements. There's a supplement on the 3 T's. There's also a separate supplement on gold. Then there's also other ancillary materials out there. So, for example, the OECD has done some upstream and downstream pilot programs, and with respect to the downstream pilot program in particular, there's a final downstream pilot program report. So because of the relationship of the OECD guidance to step 3 and also to the audit, it's going to be critical that you have a good handle on the OECD framework, since you're going to have to use it as you build out your due diligence framework as well as your related policies and procedures. And the tricky part about the OECD framework is it's not always easy to apply. It wasn't written as a legal compliance document, so it's not a rule. It's part of a multi-stakeholder initiative, so it consists of recommendations rather than requirements. There's inconsistencies in some places in the guidance, in the supplements, and how you apply it also is a function of where you sit in the supply chain, and then you also have to tailor it to your own particular facts and circumstances. And then to add to the complexity of that as well, there still isn't consensus yet in the audit community on how to apply certain aspects of the guidance to the audit requirements under the conflict minerals rule. So it's a very important piece of your compliance process, and if it's something that you haven't focused on yet, you're going to want to make sure that you do understand that guidance as you move forward. Now, another critical piece of this for companies is figuring out how you want to structure your outreach, because as we talked about before, an important part of this is that you have to reach out to your suppliers to get the information that you need for your compliance under the rule. And I just want to talk about two of the boxes on this page. So I'm going to talk about the two on the bottom row here. And you know, a lot of companies used to ask us whether they should do a pilot program. It's probably getting a little late for that at almost all companies, but I still tend to recommend that a lot of people stagger their approach. And you know, staggered outreach maybe isn't that much different than a pilot program, although I guess I look at it a little differently because a lot of the pilot programs that people did, there was an element of randomness to them. You know, whereas when you do pilot programs, you're really you know, putting your suppliers into buckets based on risk, and you're going out to your higher risk suppliers, however you wind up defining that first, and then, you know, going to the lower risk suppliers after. So somewhat less random. And I think for a lot of companies that staggered approach does make sense. You know, a lot of companies don't necessarily have the bandwidth to go out to all of their suppliers at once and start evaluating responses. Also, a staggered approach, you know, enables you to focus on the most important people first. And then also it does have some of the benefits of a pilot program, giving you the ability to refine your approach going forward to the extent you need to do it. Now, on this other bucket here on the bottom right, you know, the point I just want to make here is, you know, as companies start to really kind of delve in and think about how they're going to do their outreach, you know, a lot of companies come to the realization that, you know, this is just too big of a task for them to do on their own. You know, they do need help with, in many cases, the data gathering and analysis, and a lot of them kind of going into this felt they could do it on their own. So you really want to, I think, you know, have an honest assessment of your internal capabilities around that. And, you know, and I think Carrie will talk a little bit more about some of that during her piece of this. So I just wanted to hit on it briefly. Yeah, now as we've talked about at a few different points already, as part of this, the cooperation of your suppliers is going to be essential to being able to comply with the rule. And, you know, a lot of companies, you know, their initial response is, well, you know, there's a lot of information out there on this. Our suppliers already should know about the rule, and we're going to assume that they know about it. Maybe you've sent out a quick Dear Supplier letter just highlighting it, and, you know, then you've left it up to your suppliers beyond that to get up to speed. But what we're finding still, you know, from our discussions with clients as well as, you know, other people that are, you know, a little further upstream in the supply chain, is that a lot of suppliers still do not know about the rule, especially smaller companies, especially private companies, companies that are offshore. And frankly, you know, we've seen this as more of an issue in the retail and apparel supply chain than we've seen it in, for example, electronics and automotive. So I wouldn't assume that your suppliers are up to speed on the rule. So the question is then, well, what, if anything, do you do? And, you know, I'm a big believer that, you know, you want to try and do a little bit of an honest assessment of, you know, where you think your suppliers are on this. Because if you start going out to your suppliers and they're not familiar with the rule and you're sending out questionnaires, you're going to wind up getting a much higher non-response rate, and also you're going to wind up with a lot of insufficient or incomplete answers. So you really want to think about, you know, what you might want to do on the front end to increase not only the quantity but the quality of the responses. So for some of your suppliers, should you be doing some training, maybe not on the rule, but maybe on the questionnaire that you're going to send out? Do you put out a more robust information packet that you send them? Should you have a hotline that people can call to ask questions on this? And, you know, all of that's kind of a pain in the neck, and it takes more time on the front end, but, you know, I think you're going to find that in some cases it's going to improve the quality and quantity of the responses that you wind up getting, and will ultimately save you both time and money. Now, Carrie's going to talk about a lot of what's on this slide, so I'm not going to go through all of these points, but, you know, the takeaway is that vendor outreach is going to be a lot more than just sending out questionnaires. There's a lot of art rather than all just science that goes into this, so there's going to be a lot of judgment in the process that goes into it as well. And, you know, before you start sending out questionnaires and then getting responses back, you know, you want to, I think, have really thought about all of the questions that are raised on this page. Now, you know, we've been talking a little bit about vendor outreach, but, you know, conflict minerals rule compliance is about a lot more than just vendor outreach. It also involves putting in place policies, procedures, and systems that support your compliance. And as part of this, you also need to make sure that you're focusing on risk mitigation, which is the bottom right box on this page. And we talked about the OECD framework a little bit before. One of the things that the OECD framework does talk about and provide for is a risk mitigation strategy, and it's everything from working with suppliers to achieve measurable improvements to supplier disengagement, depending upon the particular facts and circumstances. But you should be prepared that as you go through this process with your vendors, you are going to get answers that don't make you feel comfortable. In some cases, you're going to have unresponsive vendors, and you're going to have to think about, how you deal with that for purposes of your compliance. And, how you deal with those things, may be different depending upon whether you're an intermediate in the supply chain, where you have to be sensitive to customer concerns around these sorts of issues, or whether you're at the end of the supply chain. And then also, your risk mitigation strategy is going to play into your supply chain policy, which is something that you're required to also have under the OECD framework. Okay, so in my last few minutes, what I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about is disclosure and reporting, which is going to be kind of the end of the process for purposes of your year one compliance. And, there's 2 points that I want to talk about on this page. And the first one that I want to talk about is when should you start preparing your Form SD? And this is a question that we get from a lot of companies. And, if you've looked at Form SD, you may be familiar that it's not a blank form to be mechanically filled in. So it's going to require a narrative that's going to be tailored to your particular company and your facts and circumstances. So there's going to be a lot of judgment and thought that goes into the preparation of that form. So I'm a really big advocate of starting on it early and recognizing you won't have gathered and analyzed a lot of your data relevant to the form until probably sometime in the first quarter of 2014 and maybe even beyond. But I think at this point, a lot of companies, at least in broad strokes, know what the disclosure is going to say. So I think there's a lot of benefits to at least starting to sketch that out early, and obviously you'll have to refine it as you go through the process. But I think, one of the big benefits of, starting to put that together now is it'll help you better evaluate how your conflict mineral sourcing and compliance efforts may be viewed by third parties. Because you just tend to focus on it a little more when you kind of see it on a page. And then, getting to kind of the words on the page, the last observation that I just want to leave you with today as you do think about your Form SD is you want to make sure that you don't get so far into the weeds on your technical disclosure that you forget about your audience. I think at this point, too many companies are probably fixated on what they think the SEC is going to think of their disclosure. And I wouldn't be so focused really on the risk of the SEC coming down on you for a deficient Form SD, because frankly, it's not going to happen if you've prepared your filing in good faith to comply with the requirements of the rule. This isn't one of those gotcha rules where the SEC is looking to come after companies. And it's going to be an evolving process at companies, and it's going to take time for disclosure to coalesce around generally accepted market practice. So although the SEC is certainly one of the constituencies you need to be thinking about, you also want to be thinking about, are you a company or in an industry where NGOs are likely to focus on your disclosure? What about customers, consumers, consumer groups, socially responsible investors, public and union pension fund investors, socially responsible investor gadflies. So there's a lot of different constituencies that you have to think about it as you write your disclosure. So it's important as you go through this to focus on really 3 principal things. Who's likely to read it? What is it you're trying to communicate to them? And what is it you want them to take away from your disclosure? And there's a whole lot of different strategies, which I won't go into today, around how to best put your disclosure together with those considerations in mind. So I'm going to end here. I think I'm out of time at this point, and let me now turn it over to Carrie. The only other thing I'll mention is that, Jacqueline mentioned at the outset, we have a Conflict Minerals Resource Center, so there's a lot of resources on that to assist you in your compliance, and I would certainly encourage you to go to that. And also, if you go to our resource center, you can sign up so that you get announcements when we put out materials in this area, which we do on a very frequent basis. So with all of that said, let me now turn it over to Carrie.
Thank you very much, Michael, and good afternoon to everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Michael, first of all, I really want to be able to take the next 10 or 15 minutes or so and build on some of the areas that you've gone into with regard to the how. How do we do this? I've spent quite a lot of time with organizations over the past several months having discussions around how to tackle the requirements in both form and substance with respect to the reporting required under the Conflict Minerals Act. And fundamentally, organizations are first attempting to make sure that they're adopting the right strategy. Part of that is horizon-based. There's certainly what do we need to do this year. This is a new initiative, a new endeavor, and there is a certain amount of effort that has to go into baselining, creating your year one baseline. But then it's also important, as you pointed out, Michael, in your remarks, that organizations are thoughtful about how they're going to sustain this process going forward. This is not a one-shot deal. We don't get to do this once, put our pencils down, and move on to something else. This is something that the organizations are going to have to put into their basic operations, into their compliance programs, into their supply chain governance programs, such that it is sustainable and executable over a prolonged period of time. So that's our focus on making sure that our strategy is flexible. We all know that in rulings that come out from the SEC, there will continue to be refinements and changes in these rulings. Interpretations will change, the FAQs will change, strict guidance will change as the rule evolves over time. So you want to make sure that your process that you put in place, your program, has the ability to flex and adapt as those changes come out. Extensibility. Most organizations, particularly those who are focused on building leading operations and leading processes, are looking at this effort as an opportunity to bring together and create enhanced integration across different capabilities within their enterprise. They're looking at the supplier organization. They're looking at the compliance organization. They're looking at the product organization. And they're saying, we're touching all three of you simplistically, and there are other points that argue beyond that, but simplistically, we're touching three very critical aspects of our business. How do we bring those together in a way that is meaningful, that is not redundant, that leverages the information, the data that we already have, that leverages the relationship and the visibility that we already have with our extended supply chain? The fourth point on the strategy slide here is ease of deployment. As Michael's just taken us through, we're looking at a May 2014 reporting date, and we're counting backwards from that. The program also needs to factor in how are we going to view independent private sector audits, how are we going to review or to include perhaps enhanced or modified due diligence procedures as additional resources become available to us over time. And then lastly, reliability. We want to build something that's going to work and it's going to work consistently. It's going to work with a high degree of accuracy and predictability. And that includes considerations of data integrity, the form, features and functions of the program, and the technology that supports it. I think most organizations would say that they don't necessarily have a shortage of data. What they do have a shortage of is intelligence around that data. How do we use the data most effectively to derive the pieces of information, the intelligence that are necessary and germane to this program? Some of the critical components that are required from a program management perspective, as we've seen from our conversations, is to first and foremost determine applicability and to perform the RCOI. This starts from a very tactical exercise of looking through the product universe, oftentimes down at the bill of material and component part level, to make initial determinations around how you're going to group and bucket your vendors for purposes of your ongoing assessment and due diligence. As Michael said, this is not a one-shot, send out a survey to a supplier and cross your fingers and hope you get accurate information. This is, in many ways, going to create a level of collaboration and a level of engagement with our suppliers from a compliance and transparency perspective that perhaps most organizations won't have seen before. And so it's going to require that we're thoughtful about the questions that we're asking, that we're thoughtful about the responses that are coming back, In many cases, I think suppliers are going to be inclined to adopt the first-fits-all approach. They're going to be getting hit from many, many different directions for requests for this information. And as a supplier in this equation, it would seem only natural that the supplier is in and of itself going to put in a function that in many ways might attempt to boilerplate so that they can deal with the volume of requests and transactions and surveys. So it'll be very important as the recipient of that information to execute an appropriate amount of due diligence as to the applicability of information to your product set, to your relationship with the supplier. Again, due diligence in the ITSA is a conflict minerals report, an ongoing risk assessment and management process for source and due diligence. Certainly, the efforts that organizations have been undertaking here in year one might in some ways almost be deemed heroic because we are starting from a baseline of zero. But if we do it correctly, if we do it properly, we're going to be able to take and using a risk-based framework, using a source-based framework, overlay this with a process that will be much more sustainable on an ongoing basis. And as Michael said, we're going to get responses back. We're going to get information back from our suppliers that we're not always going to like, that's going to make us a little uncomfortable, but perhaps is going to make us aware of things that we weren't aware of before and will now require us to take some level of action. So making sure that your program has an appropriate closed-loop process for dealing with the anomalies, the issues, the exceptions, things that are coming up throughout this process. Good information is going to result in improvement of your relationship with that supplier and the overall integrity of your supply chain, but that information is handled very effectively and very carefully so that you get the proper utility out of it. And there's some other points to consider there around using a central repository, managing supplier communications and notifications. I don't want to say 100%, but I'm going to say 99% of the companies that I've had the opportunity to have conversations with have all said, there's no way we're going to attempt to do this through Excel and email. But we recognize right now that that is going to be an exercise in futility. So they're all looking at taking advantage of the available technologies to manage these large data sets. And I think there's two critical aspects from a data perspective, and that is one around volume. In some cases, we're talking hundreds of thousands of lines of information, if not more, and also complexity of the information. We have to be able to draw relationships between products, the component parts, component materials, the source of those component parts, bringing those back to our suppliers, and layer in their geographies, multiple locations, multiple jurisdictions, things of that nature. This data set gets very complicated very quickly. And trying to manage that in traditional two-dimensional formats like an Excel spreadsheet would be very, very challenging. So looking at taking advantage of relational data sets, many data models for bringing this information together. Adopting an integrated solution approach, again, kind of a universal theme that I'm picking up in my conversations is this is not just a technology issue, and this is not just a people issue. We can't solve this by putting a system in place and clicking the go button, and we also can't solve this by just throwing bodies at it. This is truly one of those endeavors in an organization that requires the proper marriage of technology and your people resources, what I'm calling the services perspective on this slide. So we want to leverage technology for managing that data set that I talked about, for doing integrations and taking advantage of leading practices and resources that are going to be available to us. So, a very common one that everyone is referencing and leveraging right now is the EIC questionnaire, the conference-based smelter list. Those are incredibly valuable commodities that we have to bring into our program. How does technology enable and automate the collaboration portion of our suppliers? Our organizations don't want to be sitting here managing surveys through an email interface. This is not productive. They want a solution that's going to take and send those out and manage responses and send reminders, look for the anomalies and the exceptions so that you can take and apply your human resources to the efforts and the work that really matters, which is dealing with the exceptions, dealing with the information that comes back. And then on the services, the resource side of this, again, we can't take people out of the equation. We're going to get calls from our suppliers that say, I don't understand this question. I don't know how to respond to this question in the context of the bid that I provide you. And so you will need some level of what we call level 1 support with those suppliers to field those questions, to have the FAQs that are geared to your program, your strategy, your expectations. We talked about the data model a little bit earlier, and it is a multi-threaded data set that we're talking about here. We have areas of compliance. Now, obviously, we're talking about conflict minerals today, but most organizations aren't viewing conflict minerals in a vacuum. They're viewing it in the context of programs and compliance firms that they already are managing to. Their social compliance groups, their environmental compliance groups, things they're doing from a CCPAT perspective, so on and so forth. And drawing relationships again between organizationally your own business, your own products, your own geography, and then drawing relationships with your third parties, your suppliers, import-export parties in the equation. All of that information so that you're executing an appropriate end-to-end chain of custody enforcing due diligence inquiry. And that the information is coming back in a way that's normalized. And one of the biggest hurdles that organizations are going to face, and Michael alluded to this as well, is defining and designing your questions correctly. Ask them too narrowly, and you're not going to get the information that you need to really create an effective due diligence. Ask them too broadly, and you're going to end up with really interesting information that's very hard to normalize and run analytics against. So striking that balance and setting your questions and articulating how respondents are to return information is going to be critical to the ongoing analysis of the information. From a supplier product SCM information management, we're able to facilitate supplier declarations. Manage not only what I call your tier 1 or first degree suppliers, but also have the capacity to extend your information gathering into the extended supply chain, perhaps more accurately, the extended supply web. We've got to get out to our suppliers, to the sub-suppliers, the sub-suppliers, third-party auditors. Many of you on the call today use third-party audit organizations already to interact with your factories and your suppliers. How do we leverage those relationships and get information from those sources into our conflict minerals program? Managing details of transit, country of origin, BOM information. This is information that organizations already have. It's residing in your system. But those are transactional, operationally oriented systems. How do we tap into those? Through actual technical integration, how do we tap into those and extract that data, again, bring it back, correlate it across our suppliers so that that data becomes meaningful and it becomes a guidepost for us in how we want to search through and gather information. And that bottom bullet there, ensuring traceability and visibility across the extended supply chain. Performing surveys to determine applicability. I mentioned that many organizations are looking to leverage the EIC template. One of the things you want to pay attention to in your technology solution is kind of modify it. I think the EICC template is a great starting point. But this is an opportunity for you to have a level of engagement, a level of interaction with your supplier that in many ways is unprecedented. And I think that organizations would be missing a terrific opportunity if they didn't use these surveys to ask things that are germane to their relationship with the supplier or to their business. Things that may be beyond within the standard EICC template. So managing your surveys, managing your information, again, that's something that's table stakes. This is automated stuff that you don't want your folks doing manually. Tracking progress. As you move through the due diligence program, where am I? How am I doing? I want to look at that from a product perspective. I want to look at it from a supplier perspective. I want to look at it perhaps from a third-party perspective. I want to look at it from a geographic perspective. The slicing and dicing of the data so that you can basically take that information and spin it around, look at it from different lenses and different perspectives. It's that type of analysis that's the real value in this program, because that's going to let you know where those holes are, which in turn directs you as to where you need to spend your resources so that you're spending wisely and you're spending in a focused and targeted way and not just taking a shotgun or scatter approach across the totality of your supply chain. Managing source and chain of custody due diligence. There's a lot of risk elements to this. And when you take, it's just in any other program, or I suspect with many programs in your own organization, if you can layer a risk view on that, again, that gives you the opportunity to target and direct your limited resources in ways that are going to produce the best results for you, the most effective results for you. Excuse me, PM assessments and audit management, again, it's about visibility, it's about transparency. You don't want to have your folks spending time trying to produce the where are we report. You want your folks spending time producing the where do we need to be worried report, what concerns do we have, how are we doing type of report. And again, I talked earlier about the fact that you're going to find things out when you start asking these kinds of questions of these suppliers. No one's going to fault you for having unearthed that information. The proof will be in how do you deal with it. Once you do know something, what steps, what efforts have you taken to address the information that's come to light, and ultimately perhaps build ongoing improvement in that area. And lastly, the last remark here before we take some question and answers is, our perspective is that Conflict Minerals as a program, though in most cases I see this being driven out of compliance organizations, it ultimately does need to come back and tie in with your supplier governance function for long-term sustainability. This is another dimension of supplier performance management, supplier compliance management, supplier risk management, supplier audit management. Again, looking at opportunities here, the organizations, I think, that will generate the greatest benefit to themselves out of going through their conflict mineral exercise and generate the best value from their spend will be those that are effective in tying this in to the ongoing programs in their organization. I have provided some information here on MetricStream. As Michael has shared, their service center, their information center, we do have information available to all of you with regard to conflict minerals. We're looking at it as a technology vendor in this space, what we see our customers doing. I would encourage you to go out and check out that information. What I'd now like to do is hand it back over to Jacqueline. We'll spend the last few minutes of our time together conducting the question and answer session. Jacqueline, over to you.
Thanks, Carrie. So it looks like we do have a few questions. Okay. Says one, should our company conduct an internal audit of the CM plans and progress in 2013? Also, what should be addressed in this audit?
Carrie, you want to take that, or do you want me to take that one?
If I've got some additional thoughts, I'll jump in.
Sure. No, that sounds good. This is a really good question, because this is one that comes up at a lot of our clients. In year one, most companies do not expect that they're probably going to need an external audit under the rule because of the conflict undeterminable designation, and to the extent that your products are DRC conflict undeterminable, then you're not required to do an audit. However, and there's always a big however or but to these sorts of things, is
passed through the hands of over 250 master craftsmen who work on the tiniest of details with great care. Wow. Roosh. Pity we don't make shoes for women.